welcoming applause to Dr. Pattnaik. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Vivek. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. So happy to see your beautiful faces, because I think what has brought us all together to, this event, Cinema Paradiso being the, beautiful host here. And I thank you, Vivek, and thank you so much, Arnaud. Thank you, Alliance Française, for having me come here to do these lectures, because it's not just important to me because it's my work, but I also think the work I do somewhere touches other people and their thoughts, and hopefully helps us rethink everything that is wrong in society, things that are exciting for us, things that are pleasurable. Hopefully we can ask some of these questions today through the lens of French philosophers. So before I begin, I want to say right at the outset something that is very important for me to say, which is that when I study Bollywood cinema, and that's my area of research, my book is going to come out very soon. It's called Masquerade in Bollywood cinema, right? Masquerade meaning disguises and duplicity. I don't know how many of you have seen any Bollywood films. We have this trope of mistaken identities, people appearing as they are not, people disguised as somebody else. It's there in all cinema, actually. And cinema, in a way, is masquerade, because actors are acting as somebody and so on and so forth, right? And hopefully I will connect this to French philosophy as I'm going to get there. But when I started work, it was very important for me to put out there that I'm a cinephiliac. Like, I actually love this cinema. I'm not talking down to it like some kind of highbrow academic, right? And this is an idea that I borrowed from, I was very influenced by, I should say, Lalita Gopalan's work. She works on Indian cinema, and when she researched it in the US, this is one of the things she found. A lot of people did not understand Indian cinema. They did not understand Bollywood cinema because it was presented from a, let's say, Eurocentric perspective, right? They didn't have the language with which to understand it, so it ended up looking ridiculous or like a copy or like a something that is derived from somewhere else. And it's from Gopalan that I learned this idea that no, it is part of our lives. All cinema is, and in India cinema is very much part of our lives. So I am entrenched and embedded in the discourse that I'm going to speak of, and that's why it's very important to put it out there that I am a cinephiliac, and that's the space I'm going to speak from. The other aspect of what I do, the work I do, and I will be showing it through the clips and so on, is that I'm a thinker of the body. Right, the human body, maybe even the animal body, right? Why is the body important? When I was a student, I was a scholar of literature, and then later went on to do my MPhil and so on, and we study a lot of French philosophers, a lot of them. I don't know what students are doing today in those same spaces, but at the time that I was studying, this was, I would say, from 98 to 2006 and so on. It was very important, the post-structuralist philosophers, right? They were very important figures. Michel Foucault particularly, Jacques Derrida was another one, right? And I will refer to all of them later as well, just signaling this out there. Two of the things that they brought to the fore, which I think was missing when we were studying literature and other things and media, was the importance or the singularity or the centrality of the human body to discourse. This particularly in the Western philosophical tradition, after René Descartes and the Enlightenment and so on. I'm sure you've heard of the very popular saying by Descartes. Anybody? Cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. So because of this, so Cartesian philosophy and so on, in Western thought especially, and it's there in a lot of Indian philosophy also, it became, I would say, mind-oriented philosophy. Everything became about ego, about thought, and the human ability to think was somehow shown as superior, right? And as the way to understand everything. Cinema, on the other hand, was one of those miraculous things that is very corporeal. It is very bodily. It is bodily in the way we watch films, right? In the way we sit and the way we feel, right? If you see something coming, like remember the first film, I'll try and say this in my French, it's terrible, so pardon my French, no pun there. Le train arrive en gare, right? The first film, Lumiere Brothers. When it was first played, I don't know how many of you know, people would just get up and just run away, right? Because that's how bodily it is. It's visceral, it's corporeal, it feels like the train is actually arriving, right? Today also, if you're fond of horror films, or if you're fond of romantic cinema, right? You feel butterflies in your stomach, you cry, you weep, and so on. There are American films that are called weepies, right? Melodramatic cinema. It's a corporeal, it's a bodily kind of, cinema. So that's the other aspect of the work that I do, to think about why bodies have been left out of discourse, out of thought and intellectual capacity and so on. And why the body? Because the body is the seat of a lot of things, of our identity. Like I'm standing here and speaking to you, there are things that I'm feeling. It's an embodied identity, isn't it? You identify me as I identify myself as a woman. Not everybody does, but I do, and you probably are seeing that when you're also speaking or listening to me, right? So why is the body pushed to the margins? Of the two philosophers that I will speak of today, one is Michel Foucault and the other is Simone de Beauvoir, and I love both of their work. And if I was to say I'm slightly more leaning towards one over the other, it would be Foucault. And I will say why, because Foucault is one of the philosophers who in a way brought back the body to Western critical thought, right? He challenged some of these Enlightenment notions that rationality was somehow the source of all the good and all that is ultimately human potential and so on. Because the body, especially when Foucault is writing, Europe has gone through wars and everything, and we have seen what science can do in a way to the body also, to the human body. In India today, as a woman, a thinker, philosopher, whatever, artist, I feel like my embodied experience is constantly up for questioning, constantly up to a place of violence where I have to answer bodily, give evidence, let's say. There is a very famous, lovely academic called G.N. Devi who works on tribals in India. I remember him saying this once and it really stayed with me. Devi said that, there are two kinds of people in India and maybe even elsewhere who have to constantly give evidence, bodily evidence of their identity. One is the tribal and the other is a woman, right? So Devi's words have always stayed with me, constantly giving evidence of your body. What does that mean, right? So Foucault is a philosopher who introduced us to this idea that body, especially sexuality, what we assume is a natural given thing, isn't like that. It actually has a history. The very materiality of the body, according to Foucault, is something that is produced through forces in society, through discourse and especially through power. Foucault is a philosopher of power, and that is why his work speaks to so many of us. Because if you look at it, the society that you live in, as Foucault will say, power is not something outside. We always assume that, the policeman out there with the baton, there is the prison cell, or there is a terrible government or whatever. Like power is somewhere else, and here I am, and power is going to somehow, work itself on me, right? Yes, impose itself on me. Foucault changed that notion. Said, no, your bodies are where power also resides. The way in which we think about our bodies, what we do with our bodies. He says power is capillary. It's a lovely idea. So what you do with your bodies, how it runs through, right? How you read sexuality. All of it actually has a history. There is nothing natural or given about this materiality. Oh, this is so radical an idea, it's not easy to accept, because you look at our bodies and you think, but it's there, the materiality of it and so on, what is he talking about? But if you think deeply about what he's saying, you will see, and he analyzes it through European history especially, there was there was an obsession, Foucault says, from the 18th century onwards in Europe. And for me, this becomes, for those of us who are post-colonial scholars, becomes very interesting because it's exactly after the 18th century that India and other parts got colonized as well. So for us, the colonial history is very important in the way we think about our bodies. Just yesterday, I met someone who told me, you know, I went to the museum here. I don't know if Celeste is here. No, she's not here. So she told me, I went to the museum here and I saw that in India, actually, women used to wear saris from underneath the, you know, so when did this breast become such a thing to cover up and so on? Much of it is Savarna Brahmanical thought. Much of it is also colonial Victorian ideology, right? We will see in the films, for instance, one of the works I do is also on the transgender community. How did gay sex or transgender identity, how did it come to be criminalized in India? Were they always seen as criminals? History tells us no. This is what Foucault tells us. How does that body get configured through power and history as a deviant body? So all bodies and sexualities have a certain history. So very important idea to remember for Foucault, he calls it biopower. Right, so in this age of kings and so on, the king has the right to kill, right to take life and so on. King has all power, right? In a modern society, there are no kings. So Foucault says, where does power go? Power becomes this kind of, biopower is one of them. Medical science, prisons, he looks at all these institutions and what they do to the body and how identity is produced by incarcerating the body, right? By, in a way, chaining it or surveillancing it or reading it in such a way that you produce that which is normal and that which is abnormal. Nothing natural about normal and abnormal. It's a discursive production. It is produced through discourse, medical discourse and so on and so forth. The other person, and I'll hope to link both of them, that is very exciting. We're going to speak about is Simone de Beauvoir, as I said. How is it connected? Now, Beauvoir was one of the first philosophers, and amazing that she's writing in Second Sex came out when 1949, 1950, and I find it, and so many of us find it relevant even today. That radical idea in the Second Sex, what does she say? One is not born a woman, but becomes one. On est née la femme, on le devient, becomes woman, right? What does this mean? You're not born into your sex. You can see now the overlaps with Foucault. Foucault is writing many years later, and Foucault is not a feminist in that sense, but you can see why feminist academics would be excited by Foucault's work, because Beauvoir has said something very similar from a very different perspective. Right? As a woman who feels oppressed by patriarchal society. So she says, sex or my sex, my gender, is not something I was born with. It's not a given. It's a coming into, it's a becoming. So the work I do likes to understand how cinema is a kind of becoming of woman, right? What is this thing that we see on screen and how is it a form of biopower? What kind of female bodies do we see? Is it representing women in Indian society, or is it creating a certain, configuring a certain kind of femininity through projecting the body in a certain way? And it's so difficult. I only have, a few films and a few ideas to discuss, but this is an entire genealogy that we're looking at, right? Not a history, but what Foucault gives us, genealogy. What's the difference? You think they're the same thing. So Foucault says no. History assumes that there is something that needs to be studied and needs to be dug out, and can be dug out and known, like what happened to the body in such and such age and so on. Foucault turns this around powerfully and says no, there are no histories, there are only genealogies. A genealogy basically admits that the very object that you are going to study, right? That in itself is not a given or a natural thing, but constructed according to the way in which society, power, discourse changes, right? So the object of scrutiny, the object of study is not a given. So if our object is a body, or the female body, or the other body, cinema for me is one of those, or has, I would say, multiple genealogies of constructing the female body and producing femininity in a particular way. No easy references here. I don't believe, I keep getting asked this question a lot, does cinema corrupt society and so on? No, I don't think there is such a simplistic relationship between cinema and society. You don't just go watch something and then go and abuse somebody. It doesn't really work like that. It's a complex relationship. That's why the clips I want to show you, I want to show how they configure female corporeality, femininity in a certain way through power. Right? And what are the forms of power we're looking at? The ones I'm looking at is one of them is heteropatriarchy. Not just patriarchy, not just the domination of men, etc. and so on, but heterosexual patriarchy. Right? Now, Simone de Beauvoir did not speak of heterosexuality. She only spoke of patriarchy when she talked about becoming woman, right? But what is that kind of becoming? Like, let's say I'm watching a film and there is a kind of woman shown and I don't feel I identify with this at all. This happens a lot in Indian cinema while I'm enjoying it, but I'm not seeing myself necessarily reflected, right? What kind of corporeality comes into the picture? What does it do to me? What is the split between the audience and the screen? And how is it configuring my identity accordingly, right? So the first clip I want to show in this process of how cinema becomes or helps become or is part of this process of becoming woman or becoming a certain kind of body. The first clip that I'm going to show you. So this is the clip and it's from a film. I'll just quickly give you the story. This is Jaya Prada, the actress, for those of you who don't know. She, in this movie, this is from 1970s. One of the things that Beauvoir talks about is reproduction is the thing that patriarchy uses in a way to configure women's identity in such a way that they remain outside the market, within the domestic space, and forever, as it were, without value. Because two ways in which this happens, as Beauvoir points out, one is that the work that she does at home, whether it is reproduction or taking care, raising children and so on, there is no market value to that. So she's not paid for it and so on, right? The other is ideological, where you have convinced women that femininity is closely related to their ability to give birth, right? In India, I find there is another aspect which Beauvoir does not look at naturally, because she comes from a much more privileged space and a different space culturally altogether. It is not just motherhood that configures women's corporeality in bodies, but it is also the desire for a male child. As you know, in India, female feticide was a huge thing. Even today, there are brilliant books out there where doctors talk about, despite the law saying that you cannot choose between a male and a female child, you cannot see the gender and the sex of the baby, people still want to do it, and women still lose status in society when they do not produce a male child. So motherhood as one of the ways in which cinema configures the body through reproduction, producing corporeality. This woman, she has basically adopted a child who is not her own, right? Jaya Prada, the character, and raised him like her own. But there is an unfortunate accident and so on, and he dies, right? And she goes completely crazy. Now, the reason I'm showing this is because this kind of a plot was a very repetitive trope, where you saw a woman's identity completely surrounded, veered, entirely pegged onto, anchored onto her ability to be a mother and how good a mother she is, her entire mental health, emotional health, everything. The clip is very interesting because you will see the woman who's seeing her, right? It's a woman, but it's a male gaze. Who's seeing her is her daughter. Ironically, who she is missing is the son, or the adoptive son, who has been killed. She is a lunatic after that, and it's the actual biological daughter who grows up, who has never had her mother's love or care, right? Produced through erasure. This is one of the ways in which bodies are produced. Like, we think they're produced through visibility, but they can also, and thanks to Foucault we know this, they can also be produced through exclusion or invisibility. So the girl child, in a way, as never existing as a girl child, having grown up to be a woman and now a mother. So you directly see her born, and then the next thing you see is that she's a grown woman who's also a mother and who sees her mother only as a mother. And what does she do in the plot? She has a son of her own, and she looks at her mother. She finds it very distressing that the mother is crying and has become a lunatic. So she gives away her own biological son to her own mother. So all of this, what I'm talking about, just keep this in mind, the reproductive discourse as configuring identity. So basically you see that cinema, and this is one example, naturalizes, right? Naturalizes the idea of reproduction and desire for a child and so on. What happens then, in relationship with cinema to society? I have many friends and so on who, for instance, do not want to have children, or who cannot have children, or let's say who simply don't think that their entire identity is based in motherhood and so on. Those of us who've gone through postpartum, or those of us who have, I'm a trauma survivor, who have survived trauma within a domestic violence situation. What happens when cinema suggests that your entire identity, mental health and so on, is not just wound up in reproduction, but it is also, what I'm saying, it is also naturalized as central to, essential to women's identity. So Beauvoir, even though a little bit of an essentialist, was one of the early, I would say, anti-essentialist thinkers. Foucault is a completely anti-foundationalist, anti-essentialist. By that, what I mean is, we are told in society that some things are essential to us. And Foucault and Beauvoir both kind of subvert that and say, Foucault says, that which is actually the effect of power is presented by society as the cause. Right? It is subverted. That which is actually the effect, that is the imagination or the discourse of society, presented to us as the natural, obvious, whatever reason why women's identity exists. In India, it's very interesting because there is a great distance, right, between French philosophy, you think, and yet there isn't, and the Indian, cultural systems. One of the ways I find very exciting to look at is, we're looking at discourse and power, right? One of the ways in which power manifests itself through corporeality is religion, of course, right? Mythology. Here too you saw, it is again referring to the story of Krishna, and basically Krishna is the adoptive child of Yashoda, and Yashoda here is both this mother, and this mother is also referring to that Yashoda, the mythological one, whose love for her son, Krishna, who's a god, is celebrated throughout the times. A question I find myself asking again and again, where are the stories of celebrating a mother's love for a girl child? Judith Butler and Julia Kristeva also, who we'll talk about maybe a little bit later. But Judith Butler, an American philosopher, she asks us what, when Freud talks about the boy child and the Oedipal complex and everything, it should stand to reason that the girl child also feels the same things. That deep attachment for the mother, that sense of jealousy when the father comes in and so on. How come Freud becomes suddenly silent when it comes to the girl child, right? So Butler points out that it is not that he is explaining heterosexuality as a natural thing, but rather heterosexuality is already there in Freud's explanation, so he's quick to silence, right? So again, this is the effect becoming, as it were, the cause. So the next clip I have, because I'm talking about this, again, how religion is used to configure female identity in India, okay? Now, in India, we have this other problem with, discourses and sexuality, especially since Foucault is the one who's talked about sexuality as something that's produced and configured by discourse. One of the discourses is religion, right? Tradition, normally looked at as tradition. The other, because we were colonized and so on, and today we are a modern society, is the idea of modernity. So when it comes to women especially, never really the male identity. Again, going back to Beauvoir, men are transcendent, she says, whereas the female identity immanent. So she says, patriarchal society will always create the female identity as immanent, male identity as transcendent. What does she mean? What she means is that identity is something that can escape culture, specificity, the body, whatever. It can become something larger than it itself. It can become a more universal identity, like he taken for, the default, let's say, right, for every kind of identity. But woman, she's never taken as the default. She has to be brought back again and again to, here you saw the reproductive role, there are other ways also, sexualized and so on, brought back to the body over and over again, right? So in India, we have this double bind where only woman has to constantly become the site of tradition versus modernity, which creates a lot of anxiety, contradictions, and so on. So the two clips we will see after this try to, from a heteropatriarchal perspective, try to configure female bodily identity and corporeality through the modernity tradition binary. This clip is from the film Satyam Shivam Sundaram. I don't know how many again of you have seen it. Raj Kapoor's directed film, again from the 70s, same time that this other film is from. Zeenat Aman the actress plays a village girl in India, and there is a boy from the city. So you also have tradition, modernity as a gender divide. The village girl is the traditional girl, stands for tradition, and the male masculine figure stands for modernity, right? He comes in and it's through and falls in love with her. I just want us to see just this scene and how the body, which is not normally supposed to, female body, not supposed to be projected in India as a source of titillation or pleasure or whatever, right, is, you use, I shouldn't say use, but framed by tradition and religion to project a typical heteropatriarchal male gaze over the female body, okay? So this one is Satyam Shivam Sundaram. I'm stopping it because we're running out of time, but you get the idea. One of it is the male gaze and so on, refracted through the religious discourse. The other thing that, as I was watching, I remembered, I forgot to share, it's also the Beauvoir who also reminds us, she reminds us that in this immanence, transcendence, binary, male-female binary, it's always also, it's constructed in such a way that man's identity depends on woman, right? She is the other. She is always the other of man. So he's the one who will awake, but her role in society is there to let him understand more about himself. I cannot tell you the number of Bollywood films that actually show you this philosophy at work, and you can take it all the way up till very recent films also. I'm not that young, so when I say recent, my students usually laugh at me. I'm looking at maybe, 2013, 14, but even something like Jab We Met, it's quite a recent film. You'll see the same idea. It's exactly as Simone de Beauvoir is talking about. The woman's identity is entirely there for that male identity to, as it were, find its true meaning and its true self and so on, right? Now, the clip that I'm showing after this, again, very interesting take on this discourse of tradition and modernity. It's a song called Main Ka Karu Ram. It's a kind of comical song. It's funny and so on. Yeah, it's a very cute thing. This analysis is actually Asha Kasbekar's brilliant critic, again, scholar, and I will show you and I will link it to, and hopefully you can link it to, now that we've talked about Foucault and Beauvoir so much. You see this construction of what we call a pativrata woman, like a woman who is completely devoted to her husband and so on, right? That's what most of Indian cinema was, at least till the 70s. There was this anxiety of showing the good, ideal woman, right? If you look at Tanika Sarkar's Hindu Wife, Hindu Nation, a lot of the clues will be there. The Hindu wife and how she's represented on screen becomes a very important trope and idea, right? This is that Hindu wife. She's pativrata, she loves her husband and so on. The husband, on the other hand, see tradition, modernity again, woman, man. The husband, Raj Kapoor, is suited and booted and so on, and he's somewhere, I forget where, Sweden or somewhere, I don't know, where there are good bars and there's a lot of lovely, dancing happening and so on, and he wants to go out and have fun. And the man can partake of the other world, you see. And this is not just in Indian society. If you look at even Donne's poetry, it's very much there. If Donne, a metaphysical poet, European poet, he says that if we are going to be a compass, you be that point, that, the point of the compass which you put on paper, and I will be the roving end. I can go around the world, you be that static, the immanent, right, one. Now, what happens now if you want to show a woman as both the carrier of modernity and tradition? And this is a double bind, this production through a double bind, the woman's body, you will see here. She doesn't want her husband to go out because she doesn't want him to be watching all of this, right? So this kind of narrative is used as a framework to produce her body not just through the male gaze, but also let's say a non-Indian male gaze, right? Non-traditional male gaze, because she will now dress up as one of the cabaret dancers to try and stop him from going to cabaret. Right? So she's going to say that you can see this at home, why do you want to go out, right? So the body is produced, I would say, at the liminality, at the schism between tradition and modernity. That's the weight that women in India have to carry all the time. I think, yeah. So, I'm sorry I didn't translate that one. It basically, for those of you who don't understand, she's saying, oh God, what do I do? I'm stuck with this old fool. Like basically, and she's saying, you know, here I am with a peacock's walk and so on, but this guy, he just has gray hair and so on. All my friends' partners, they went to the market and they got flowers for their partners, and my dude went and got a cauliflower instead, right? So this is what she's doing, and she's joking around and so on and saying that. So again, what Foucault also talks to us about surveillance, right? And he's doing it from the perspective of governance, right? He says that in modern society, surveillance becomes a very important mechanism. How does this happen? With the birth of the panopticon. So he reads the birth of the history of the prison. That's the first place where the panopticonal eye, panopticon, was some place where you can see everything at the same time, right? To have absolute surveillance, right? So he looks at 18th century in Europe as the birth of the panopticon. For me, it is very interesting to see, again, cinema as a form of surveillance, but that's obviously philosophical, not a direct surveillance, a symbolic kind of surveillance. When I think about women in society, I think the idea again of the panopticon, or why women, even other marginalized identities, right? Marginalized sexual identities, racial, caste identities. The idea of being under surveillance all the time is a very, very important one, right? For instance, in India right now, there is this huge debate about it has been burning for a while. How do we make things safer? Some people believe more and more surveillance cameras. I'm not one of those people. I don't believe that that makes things safer. That can actually endanger. That is more of what I have been talking about. That is more of producing the body, allowing someone to have access to bodies and constantly keeping the body as a product of power, as a product of the gaze. If you truly want safety, then I think what we are doing, for instance, more dialogue, more awareness, right? Teach younger people how to, let's say, respect women and so on and so forth. What surveillance leads to is something else altogether. It's another form of power that produces the body in a certain way. Now, what if the body, and this is very much related to violence, right? Surveillance and violence go hand in hand, and supposedly, again, Foucault turns this around, supposedly surveillance is supposed to stop violence. But as we have seen in Indian society in so many examples, and we are unfortunately willingly, and not just in India, everywhere, handing over our bodies, our data, our information to more and more and more surveillance. That just means more and more and more power for governance, any form of governance. And that will obviously, as we can see, lead to many forms of violence, whether it comes to geopolitical violence or it comes to actual bodily violence upon women and so on. So this is the final segment, which I want to talk about, the most important one, the body as a site of violence. That is also something that Foucault alerts us towards, right? This is the space that not just, he says that it is inscribed by violence. For Foucault, the body is produced as marked by violence. Sexuality can be such a mark. Heteropatriarchy can be such a mark. Medical discourse can be such a mark. Mental health can be such a mark. In fact, all of you can just keep adding, I think, even though Foucault doesn't talk about it, nationality can be such a mark and so on. Think about refugees whose bodies are again produced as other because of our politics of nationality, right? Just because they don't belong to this side of the border or that side of the border. So the next clip that I want to show is actually quite a disturbing clip. It is one of the many examples in which cinema, as I said, as surveillance and as a production of the female body, as something that is violable, right? What do I mean by that? The body is configured in such a way that it is presented as deserving of violence, right? So it's not a simple thing of just justifying violence, but producing the body according to existing lines of power and so on. So you see, and you will see when you see this thing, but just to set up and frame it, you see literally 4 people like a panopticon surrounding a woman. I have another clip that is the same thing in a different film in Omkara, but we may not have time for that. So her body is literally surrounded and she is being threatened, right? It is literally rape being kind of produced as song and dance. Very disturbing. They're giving her rape threats. But what do I mean by the body being configured according to power? The lyrics, if you hear, are telling us, and the visual language as well, that a certain kind of body, the modern body, right? The arrogant body, the body that will not subscribe to the reproductive, normative, sexuality and so on, is the body that you can inflict power on. Now, only if it were that easy. All female bodies are, sites of power in Indian society, but this is how power operates. It tries to show you that if you're that girl, if you're that woman, you will not be harmed. If you're this woman, you will be harmed, and so on, right? Again, goes back to mythology, and the beauty of a lot of Indian mythological stories is that a lot of people don't understand this, I think, that it also shows, like the Ramayana story, it shows some of the hypocrisies of society, right? Sita, when she is thrown out of society, it's not just there for only celebrating Ram. You do see the author, the writer, the narrative empathizing with the kind of violence that she is subjected to, right? So the violence here, not of that kind, of course. There is no empathy, nothing. It's celebratory of male glory.
ये लड़की बड़ी मगरूर है, इसे अपनी जवानी पे हुरूर है। ये लड़की बड़ी मगरूर है, इसे अपनी जवानी पे हुरूर है। ये लड़की बड़ी मगरूर है, इसे अपनी जवानी पे हुरूर है। हम इसका हुरूर तोड़ेंगे, इसको न कहीं का छोड़ेंगे। ये लड़की बड़ी मगरूर है, इसे अपनी जवानी पे गुरूर है। हम इसका हुरूर तोड़ेंगे, इसको न कहीं का छोड़ेंगे। ये लड़की, ये लड़की, ये लड़की, ये लड़की।
So yeah, more and more physical harassment and so on, right? One of the things that Michel Foucault also talks to us about is topography, place. Place also produces and configures bodily identity in a certain way. So for a gender perspective, right, from a feminist or femininity perspective, the femininity that belongs to the house may be rewarded, but the femininity that belongs to the street, remember, it is not just what she's wearing, it's also because you're out late at night in the dark streets, you're not supposed to be here and so on. That is also configuring her body as rapeable, punishable and so on. Now, Beauvoir, of course, talked about male, female and so on. She didn't talk about, unfortunately, and there's a lot of critique on that, about race and other forms of identity that intersect with what does it mean to say female? right? My experience as a privileged upper caste, even though I'm anti-casteist, but I am an upper caste woman in India, is very different from a Dalit woman in India, right? It is very different from the house help who comes to work in my house. While I might find something like cinema extremely problematic as a kind of male gaze and disturbing and so on, for her it might even be pleasurable. Smita Patel, a very famous Indian actress, had said in India, cinema is so important that woman who works, from 6 in the morning to 10 at night, if she earns even 10 rupees a month, she will keep 2 rupees to watch 2 Amitabh Bachchan films, tucked away in her blouse, right? So what does it mean? There is no universal or singular woman or femininity, right? That's something that I think Beauvoir has faced a lot of criticism for, this becoming woman. But I don't think when I read Beauvoir that she forecloses the discussion that in the process of becoming, we can bring in all of these other cultural aspects as well. One of them is heterosexuality or heteronormativity. Very important in India because we literally have very few films that celebrate same-sex love, right? As you know, till very recently, Section 377, which criminalizes homosexuality, was not even abolished, right? It wasn't even read down. And Supreme Court even once held it up, even though the Delhi court had read it down. Why this, So Monique Wittig, that's where this powerful radical French feminist thinker comes in. She's not identified as a philosopher. I don't know why, because she is, but she's more an essayist, novelist, and so on. Wittig takes the idea, right, of what Beauvoir is saying, where one is not born a woman but becomes one, to say that not only just that one is not born a woman, that the idea of woman is an illusion. Wittig says it's false. It is heterosexual ideology that governs this entire thing by pronouncing people according to a binary, which is man versus woman. This entire binary, Wittig says, very radical thinker, very exciting thinker, this entire binary is ideological. It's false. It's false. Il n'est pas de sexe. There is no sex, she says. There is no sex. It's an illusion. It's a delusion. And it's something that heteropatriarchal power actually creates as natural when there is nothing natural about it. If you read Wittig, you get such a sense of a charge of what she's saying, whether you agree with or disagree with, whatever, very radical. For her, it is lesbian identity, right? Especially 2 women in love, and her work mostly focuses on that, not 2 men in love and so on, but 2 women in love, when they are together. For her, the lesbian identity is a radical identity because it subverts, right? It challenges, subverts that male-female sexual identity. So the last 2 clips I have, because we are, it's almost an hour, right? More than. We will watch from the film Fire. It's one of the first, so many of you know it, same-sex film in India. Absolutely, Shaban Azmi has done such a beautiful, job in that, both of them, and Nandita Das. And this, if you remember, theaters were burnt down for this film. But very interestingly, I don't know the kind of India we live in today, I shouldn't say it, but that India, the Supreme Court held up the right for that film to be screened, saying that we cannot censor cinema, we cannot censor art, every artist has the right to show what they want to, and people actually thronged to the cinema halls to watch the film, right? So it's very heartening to read that, and this was in the 1990s. The scene I'm showing you it's between 2 women, Shabana Azmi and Nandita Das. They are 2 daughter-in-laws in the same household. The heterosexual partnership, they're married to 2 brothers. That's shown to be your typical reproductive heterosexual relationship. There's no true love, there's no charm, no one wants to know anybody. Even sex is shown to be basically rape. And we'll talk about that also, marital rape later and so on. And I think it's brilliant how Deepa Mehta configures that. And on the other hand, exactly what Wittig is saying, it's these two women who fall in love with each other because they find friendship in each other. They see each other, right? They're visible to each other. And that challenges not just the heteropatriarchal order, but because this is Indian society, heteropatriarchy intersected with caste and religion and so on, it challenges all of that. These two women, remember, are called Sita and Radha. These are very important figures in Indian society. In fact, a lot of people who protested, they just said, if you drop the names Radha and Sita, we're okay with the film, right? It's that important to show that our mythology does not supposedly support same-sex desire or love. So the first clip that you see, it's if read through Monique Wittig, the brilliant difference between the lesbian couple who challenges the normative power structures of the heterosexual couple.
I'm sorry. Please give me one more turn, please.
Radha?
Just ignore him.
Radha?
Please don't go.
Where were you?
With Sita.
Good. She looks happy these days. Maybe she's pregnant. You didn't hear me calling?
Yes, I did.
Why didn't you come?
Sita says the concept of duty is overrated.
She's young. But you know its importance. Radha, I need you.
No, Ashok. Not tonight.
Headache? Do you need aspirin?
You don't want?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, so if we see a number of the things that Monique Wittig is talking about in the Straight Mind, Le Pon's threat, I don't know how to pronounce it, but she talks about this whole idea of how marriage in heterosexual societies is just a contract. The first husband, by the way, he's not even asking her for intercourse. First of all, I need you, not about her needs. And secondly, he has just been practicing celibacy because that's what his Guruji has told him. He's never once stopped to ask her whether she wants to practice this or not, right? So it completely erases her body altogether. And what the film, again for me, who looks at femininity and corporeality, is so beautiful that when you start seeing the women from each other's perspective, right, you see the body produced in such a more different light. It is full of light, it's a place of love, it's a place of identity and so on. So the last clip, and I'll end with that and hopefully we can have a discussion, is a very powerful one, takes you back to what Wittig says, that contract between husband and wife, where she says, says, if I were to just read it to you, it's so sharp. She says, you are to serve sexually, you are to raise his children, you are to do the domestic chores, you are never to ask for money for this. If he beats you, if he rapes you, you cannot go to the police, you cannot go to the law. Surprising that, you know, this woman writing in the 80s, you know, something still relevant today as well. It still resonates. So how lesbian identity, according to Wittig, frees women. I don't know whether I completely agree or not, but you see, if you see it from, you know, through that theoretical perspective, a lot of it just does shine light here. You know, it comes through. And this is when the husband has discovered that his wife and his what would you call your brother's wife, that they are having a relationship, and he's like completely devastated, and he goes to confront her.
Radha, come to the bedroom. I have to test myself.
No.
It's really important.
Don't start again. I said no.
What do you mean, no? It's your duty. You promised to help me.
I've finished with my penance, Ashok. I'm leaving.
Leaving? Is that Sita's fault? All these new ideas in your head? Sita? Sita!
She's gone.
So that's what it is. Look, Radha. What I saw in the bedroom is a sin in the eyes of God and man. Maybe Swamiji can help you. Help us. Desire brings ruin. I know that.
Brings ruin? Does it, Ashok? You know that without desire, I was dead. Without desire, there's no point in living. And you know what else? I desire to live. I desire Sita. I desire her warmth, her compassion, her body. I desire to live again. If you want to control desire, ask for Swamiji's help, not mine.
How dare you? How dare you talk like that? Look at you, shameless Randi. Instead of begging for forgiveness, you give me lectures. One passion. What kind of wife you have become? What kind of woman are you? You should be touching my feet and asking me to forgive you. Touch my feet. I said do it. Touch my feet.
she does manage to escape. She does actually get out. It doesn't end with her dying there. The reference to the Sita also sitting through Agni Pariksha, right? In the Ramayana, the character Sita was asked to, despite being chaste, was asked by her husband Ram, because they stayed away from each other for many, many years. In India, these stories are told and retold for reason. Despite staying away from each other, it was her who had to show that she had remained chaste, not him, right? And she had to sit through that fire. So it's a beautiful use by the director of that same idea. There is so much that I can go on to say, but I will end with this. Wittig talks about when they escape. There's a beautiful scene after the two of them meet, and she says, Monique Wittig, that heterosexual marriage is like slavery, but if you are the rebellious slave, that's how, she says that slavery was abolished because of the rebellious slave. Like the rebellious slave, women can escape. They can escape the contractual marriage and so on, right? I hope to have been able to show you how cinema shows the body configures femininity in multiple ways as bodies that are sites of power, sites of desire, sites of oppression, and so much more. I hope that we can have a very invigorating discussion, because there's so much to be said about these films, really, yeah? We can open the floor for discussion, but thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
We will have a few questions here, and we can continue with drink outside,
Okay.
because we have to leave at 6:30.
Okay.
It's really my topic of research since more than 15 years in Paris.
Wonderful.
And all these authors have been very inspiring, including Judith Butler. And when you mentioned her name, I wanted to ask you, how would you interpret the queer theory? Queer.
Yeah.
Because that's one step beyond feminism,
Yeah.
beyond
Yeah.
how do you say, lesbianism. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
how would you interpret?
Yeah, thank you so much.
And fantastic.
Thank you so much. Means a lot to me.
I have too many questions, but maybe other people want to ask. The film directors, whoever they are, including this last film with Fire, they have undergone these questions.
Absolutely, yeah.
Despite the Indian society being still as I mean, reminded me the story of Calcutta. You know that medical doctor
absolutely.
was raped, and the entire country woke up. Entire country woke up, and yet, what's the solution? It's only education and waking up.
Yeah, and what kind of education, in fact, we keep talking about education, but unfortunately, this many years, 70 years plus of educating, and of course, I don't want to take away from the power of that. So many girl children being educated now who weren't earlier, and so on, and we have sex education in schools now, and so on, and yet a case like that. Imagine a young doctor going to serve on a regular day's work to be raped, and that heinously inside a hospital. Thank you so much for those very poignant questions and your very kind words. It makes the work I do worthwhile, when I hear something like that. So to answer the first question, I'm a huge fan of Butler. Not just a fan, her work informs my research work immensely. And Butler is somebody who has beautifully straddled both things, recognized her, the influence of thinkers that came before her, feminist thinkers like Beauvoir, Irigaray, Kristeva, all of them. But she has also categorically, in such a nuanced way, unpack the problems with some of them from a queer gaze, right? I think the closest that I find Butler's work is to Monique Wittig. In fact, Butler herself says that her theory of performativity, and I'll just stop and quickly talk about performativity since you brought it up. It's critical to my work also. What Judith Butler says is that nothing natural about sex or gender, right? That has already been established. But it's not so easy to say that it's not natural, so we can set it aside. Clearly, it's part of our cultural, social makeup and so on. So the very important thing for Butler is, I think, which is very different from Wittig, is that Wittig thinks there is an outside to this. Butler says there is no outside. You are born into this society. So if you are going to subvert it or invert it or challenge it, the resistance has to come from within that language, as it were. One of the ways in which she looks at gender is performativity, which is to say it's not natural, but it's a routinization of the norms of gender on a daily, ordinary, everyday, discursive or physical basis, right? Something very simple as the clothes we wear, what we do, the hair on your body, right? I had made a post on Facebook once about how I do not shave my armpit hair and what is the problem and so on. The number of women who said, wow, that is wonderful and how courageous. But I got a lot of men who also wrote to me saying, I don't think you should do that, you know. I think you should talk to me about how it's hygienic or not hygienic and so on. And I'm thinking, you know, it's my body. But you think, you know, somewhere you have been entitled or something, given the power to think that you can speak to me about why. Butler has the answer. Because she says masculinity and femininity, they have been shaped by heterosexual discourse to be one against the other, like black and white. Right? So men's identity is under peril if women do something that is not seen as feminine, right? So then what is masculine? That question starts appearing, right? So in my class, I'm constantly asking young men, or wherever I do gender talks, you know, to think about forms of masculinity that are a little more refreshing than this binary kind of thing where everything that woman is not, you are, right? So every time she becomes something that you are threatened. That's where the threat comes from. How can she be out on the streets? How can she be doing the work that we are doing? How can she do this and that, right? So for Butler, very powerful thinker in that matter, bringing in LGBTQI, her most recent work, Who's Afraid of Gender, actually responds to what's happening in America now. As you know, gender is a banned word, right? And the governance there, the government itself is afraid of gender. Because, as Butler says, there is a kind of discourse being created that gender is going to do away with masculinity altogether, with man with the capital M, as she puts it, right? There is a kind of phantasmagoria being created, right, by people who don't want young people who deviate from the norm to actually live with dignity and so on, because that is really what her work is all about. Queer theory basically allows people who don't fall into the heterosexual binary to fully express themselves in desire, in bodies, whatever, and live with the rights, and they don't want that. But why are they so afraid of that? Because their identity is linked to the exclusion of the other, whether it is gay or lesbian or whatever. It is by excluding lesbianism that heterosexuality calls itself natural, right? If we were to look at sex and gender as a spectrum, as Butler sort of encourages us to do, things would become a lot more easier. But this threatens some forms of heterosexual masculinity, femininity, and so on. Yeah. Thank you so much for that question. Someone else has. Yes, please. Good evening. Thank you, Anand.
I think today for the first time I heard the word femininity, and what difference I heard the word femininity, and what difference would you use it very specifically? What difference do you make between femininity and femininity?
Yeah. So in English we will have feminine or we will have femininity. The way in which I would use femininity is to think about the philosophy or the theory or the discourse or practices of the feminine, right? When I say feminine, it's just an attribute. Like I can say she is very feminine in her demeanor, or that's a very feminine thing to do. It's often used also in a very derogatory manner. Like let's say a man is doing something that like cooking or moving his hand in a particular way, we will say that that's a feminine gesture. But when we look at femininity, we're looking at a range of feminines, the practices of it, whether it's on cinema, whether it is through sport, whether it is through medical knowledge and so on. So when we theorize the feminine, that's how I look at it. It is femininity. And in fact, it should be femininities. because there are so many kinds of the feminine, as it were. In fact, my work questions the idea that there is an essential feminine or an essential kind of theorization of the feminine. So there is no essential femininity either. And in that sense, and again going back to Butler, she asks this question, if we don't have woman, like, because when we say feminine, we immediately associate it with woman. But does it have to be? Again, that's a heterosexual binary, right? That man and woman are not just sex binaries, but also gendered binaries. So if you are born to a particular or assigned a particular sex, you must also be that gender. You must also be masculine or feminine. But if I take femininity to include forms of feminine that are not necessarily assigned to biological sex, then we have expanded that term to include so many others. But in that case, there is another question. There's a big question about, can we do feminism, right? Can we do feminism without the idea or essential or a collective idea of woman, right? I don't have an answer to this question. This is something that I interrogate in my work, because I do believe sometimes the sign woman, no matter how, let's say, how varied, myriad, complex, nuanced, intersected it may be, is important to demand rights and so on, and to speak about a kind of universal femininity or a universal womanhood. But at the same time, I am also very much in agreement that this is a discursive production, the idea of a woman. It is not a natural thing that is out there. And can you do politics without having the idea of an essential woman or an essential feminine? I hope I have somewhat answered, the question.
So the word femininity doesn't exist?
Not that I know of. I know of feminine and femininity.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Or feminism. No, that's fine. And I think it's very important also, because in language lies a lot of the clues, right? Absolutely. So, yeah.
On that, I have a question. When I came to Auroville 2001, my neighbors delivered 2 babies, a boy and a girl, and they were both single mothers, and they tried to, I think when they were 8 months or 10 months, they tried to exchange completely the toys that they had been given. Okay. So Luna's toys went to Kilan and Kilan's toys went to Luna. Okay. And then for the next 1 year or so, I'm not sure, they could see that Kilan was eagerly looking for a car or something, and whenever he would visit somewhere, he would grab the car and discard the dolls, and Luna would do the same. So that's what my question is it either or? Is there no gender, corporal gender identity? Is it all acquired, or is it a mixture of both?
Obviously, there is something that is biological. Now I'll go to Butler. Butler says, for instance, but again, biology itself is layered. Are we talking about desire? Are we talking about hormones? Are we talking about simply the physical organs that are there? Are we talking about having the organs but not really behaving in a way that matches with that assigned gender? Are we talking about chromosomes? Are we talking about chemicals? Because biology, when we say it's just biological, we assume it's a one thing, but that itself is not the one thing, right? And biology in itself also comes with, how do I say, it has its own politics, right? There is this fabulous thinker, Anne Fausto Sterling, British thinker. She's a scientist, right, and a biologist, and her book, which I'm forgetting the name of, if you're interested, I can remember and give it to you. Brilliant book, in the 70s it was published. She talks about how biological experiments, which supposedly deliver the truth about sex, are in themselves, again, heteronormative. The very way in which you set up an experiment, whether you are doing an either-or experiment or you're dividing women into categories or man and woman and so on. Like, I'll give you a simple example, like one of them that I talk about in class, that's not her example, but you say women are, let's say, more afraid or something by nature, whereas men are not. Like, biologically it's proven or something like that, right? How did we conduct this experiment? There are so many questions to be asked. What was the the culture of, right, the race, the background of the people you collected. What room were they sitting in? What was the time when the experiment was being conducted, right? When we do this in class, I ask students to think about when would your answers differ, right? If you have conducted the experiment, let's say after 8 o'clock in a place like Delhi, where I used to be very avid in Delhi and taught there many, many years, I used to be worried about going back home even as an adult. I would have fear on my mind. So you may be showing me rabbits on the screen, but I will be thinking about when is my last bus to whatever, what kind of thing. So is that being mapped? Right? So again, when we talk about either or not, it's a complex question. There is biology, but a lot of that biology is cultural. And my question is, or my answer as a form of a question would be, does it have to be either or? Right? So many people are challenging that now, right? I identify as a woman, but I have friends who are assigned female as sex who don't identify as woman, or they identify as woman but they are lesbian and they don't necessarily dress or behave, and so many other things are associated with it, right? Wittig says it's a class. Woman is a class. It's not really a biological identity. So that's entirely socio-political. If it is socio-political, it can then be dismantled. Right? But who is afraid of that dismantling is the question. Who's afraid of doing away with either or binaries? Same with race. Jacques Derrida, in fact, he talks about how male-female is exactly like white and black. Right? White is the de facto race and black becomes the other, like male and female. So who's afraid of undoing that binary, right? What does it threaten? What is that cost?
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you all of you.